Part 1. The Problem. Chapter 1. The 3 Questions. No one asks. You've had a stroke. We're going to find out why, make sure it doesn't happen again, and get you into rehabilitation. You're doing well. These are the words, or something close to them, that most stroke survivors hear within the first 48 hours of their hospital admission. They are not wrong words. They are entirely appropriate in the context of acute neurology. The physician who speaks them has done their job. The event has been identified, the cause is being investigated, the secondary prevention pathway has been initiated, and the rehabilitation referral has been made. What no one asks, what the system has no mechanism for asking, are the 3 questions that will define the next 5, 10, or 20 years of that person's life. Not because the clinicians do not care, they do, but because the system was designed to manage the crisis, not to explain the aftermath. Because the acute phase is time-pressured and protocol-driven, and the questions that matter most at discharge are not the ones that fit neatly into a 15-minute neurology ward round. Because, frankly, no one has built a framework that makes it easy to give answers. This book is that framework. But before we can describe what complete neurological recovery looks like, and why almost no current program delivers it, we need to spend time with the 3 questions that are not asked, because inside each one is a clinical reality that has been systematically obscured from the very people it most affects. Question 1. Why am I so exhausted? Of all the symptoms that persist after stroke, fatigue is the most common, the most debilitating, and the most consistently unexplained to survivors and their families. Studies suggest that between 50 and 70% of stroke survivors report significant fatigue in the months and years following their event. Not the ordinary tiredness that resolves with a good night's sleep, but a profound, qualitatively different exhaustion that descends without warning, resists rest, and bears no reliable relationship to how much physical activity was performed. The clinical encounter around this symptom is almost universally the same. The survivor reports fatigue. The physician, rightly, rules out treatable causes: depression, sleep apnea, anemia, hypothyroidism. When none of these is identified, or when they are treated without resolution of the fatigue, the conversation tends to end. The survivor leaves with a vocabulary of absence. There is nothing wrong that we can find. This is not dishonesty. It reflects a genuine gap between what the clinical system measures and what is actually happening in the post-stroke brain. The inefficiency the scans do not show. To understand post-stroke fatigue, you need to understand something that is invisible on any MRI, CT, or EEG currently used in routine clinical practice: the energy cost of a brain reorganizing itself under duress. A stroke not only damages the tissue at the infarct site, it disrupts, often profoundly, the network connections that depend on that tissue. The phenomenon was first described by the 19th century neurologist Konstantin von Monakow, who called it diaskesis, a functional depression of brain regions remote from the lesion site, caused by the sudden loss of input they previously received. Von Monakow observed that areas of the brain that had sustained no direct injury could nonetheless cease to function normally, because the upstream or downstream tissue they depended on had been destroyed. Modern neuroimaging has dramatically confirmed and extended this insight. A stroke affecting a relatively focal cortical or subcortical region can produce measurable functional depression across an entire hemisphere, and in some cases bilaterally, within hours of the event. The brain the survivor wakes up with is not simply a brain with a hole in it. It is a brain whose entire communication architecture has been destabilized. Now consider what that brain must do next. Intact regions begin to take on functions previously performed by damaged ones. This process, often described in optimistic terms as neuroplasticity or cortical reorganization, is real and ultimately the mechanism through which meaningful recovery occurs. But in its early and intermediate phases, it is extraordinarily expensive. The metabolic cost of recruiting alternative neural pathways is substantially higher than that of using the pathways optimized for the task over decades of use. An undamaged motor cortex, performing a movement it was designed for, operates with the efficiency of a highway. An adjacent cortical region, recruited to compensate for a damaged primary motor area, operates more like a narrow country road carrying motorway traffic. It can carry the load, but only with significantly greater effort, greater wear, and far less tolerance for additional demand. This is the neurological substrate of post-stroke fatigue. The survivor is not tired because they are depressed or deconditioned or not trying hard enough. They are tired because their brain is running an enormously inefficient parallel program at enormous metabolic cost every moment of every waking day. And no one has explained this to them. Neuroinflammation, the fire that outlasts the flood. There is a second mechanism that standard clinical communication almost never addresses, and that has become one of the most active areas of post-stroke neuroscience research in the past decade. The role of sustained neuroinflammation in perpetuating symptoms long after the acute phase has resolved. In the hours and days following a stroke, the brain mounts a powerful inflammatory response. Microglia, the brain's resident immune cells, activate and migrate to the injury site. Cytokines and other inflammatory mediators flood the peri-infarct zone. Blood-brain barrier permeability increases. This response is, in the short term, partly protective. It clears cellular debris, signals for repair, and initiates the neuroplastic cascades that will eventually support recovery. But in a significant proportion of stroke survivors, this inflammatory response does not resolve cleanly. Chronic microglial activation has been documented in post-stroke brain tissue months and even years after the initial event. The reasons for this are not fully understood, but likely involve a combination of ongoing ischemic injury to white matter, disruption of the blood-brain barrier, and the activation of systemic immune responses that feed back into the central nervous system. The consequences are not abstract. Sustained neuroinflammation impairs synaptic plasticity, the very mechanism on which recovery depends. It increases neuronal excitability in ways that can manifest as fatigue, cognitive fog, emotional dysregulation, and heightened sensitivity to sensory input. It creates a neurochemical environment in which the brain's capacity to reorganize is actively suppressed, even as the rehabilitation program demands exactly that reorganization. In short, the survivor is trying to rebuild a house while the fire suppression system continues to spray water intermittently across the foundations. And no one has mentioned the sprinklers. The executive takeover. There is a third dimension to the fatigue picture that is both the most clinically interesting and the most consistently overlooked. It concerns what happens when the brain's higher-order systems, the prefrontal and executive networks, are pressed into service as compensatory managers of functions they were never designed to supervise. Under normal circumstances, a huge proportion of human movement and environmental navigation is handled by subcortical and brainstem-level automaticity. Walking down a familiar corridor, reaching for a cup, maintaining balance while turning to speak. These are not tasks that require conscious executive attention in a neurologically intact person. They run on well-rehearsed, highly efficient subcortical programs, freeing the cortex for the tasks it is uniquely suited to: planning, decision-making, social interaction, creative thought. After a stroke, when subcortical pathways are damaged or disrupted, many of these automatic functions lose their neural substrate. The brain does not simply stop performing them. It recruits only the systems with sufficient integrative capacity to substitute: the frontal and prefrontal networks. What was previously automatic now requires conscious attention. Walking requires thinking about walking. Reaching requires thinking about reaching. Balance requires active, attentional monitoring of the kind that before the stroke was handled entirely without cortical involvement. What was previously automatic now requires thinking. And thinking at this intensity and duration is exhausting in ways no amount of physical rest can fully address. This is not a failure of effort or motivation. It is a neurological inevitability. And it has profound implications for fatigue, for cognitive performance, and ultimately for quality of life. The executive systems, being consciously redirected to manage basic physical functions, are simultaneously asked to maintain professional performance, family relationships, financial management, and everything else that constituted the survivor's pre-stroke life. The result is a system under impossible load. This is the conversation that never happens in the discharge meeting. And it is the conversation that, if it did happen, would immediately change how the survivor understands their experience and what they demand from their recovery. Question 2. Why does my brain feel like it is working against itself? The second question emerges from a phenomenon that stroke survivors describe with remarkable consistency, yet that rarely finds its way into clinical language. The sense that the brain has become internally divided, that different parts are pulling in different directions, that coordination has been replaced by something more like negotiation between competing systems. This is not a metaphor. It is a reasonably accurate description of what is neurologically occurring. The inequality problem. When a stroke damages tissue in one hemisphere, the result is not simply a loss of function on that side. It is the creation of a profound and destabilizing asymmetry between the two hemispheres. The intact hemisphere, no longer receiving the balancing inhibitory input it previously got from its damaged partner, becomes relatively hyperactive. Excitability increases. Its influence over shared networks grows disproportionate to what the system was designed to accommodate. This interhemispheric imbalance, sometimes called the competition model of stroke recovery, is now one of the most important frameworks in post-stroke neuroscience. Research using transcranial magnetic stimulation, functional MRI, and electroencephalography has consistently demonstrated that the contralesional hemisphere, the undamaged side, can actively suppress recovery in the ipsilesional hemisphere, the damaged side, not through any malicious design, but simply because the normal reciprocal inhibition that keeps the two hemispheres in balance has been disrupted. The practical consequence the survivor experiences directly, but cannot name, is a nervous system at war with itself. The intact hemisphere drives its own compensatory patterns with increasing dominance. The already compromised damaged hemisphere is further suppressed by its overactive partner. The result is not simply a deficit. It is active conflict between neural systems that were designed to work in coordinated synchrony. Compensation is not recovery. This brings us to one of the most important and most poorly communicated distinctions in all of post-stroke neuroscience: the difference between compensation and true recovery. Compensation is what the brain does when it routes function around damaged tissue. It is adaptive, it is real, and it can produce impressive functional outcomes. The person who learns to use their less affected hand, who develops a compensatory gait pattern, who finds alternative cognitive strategies for tasks that previously relied on damaged circuits, that person has compensated. They may be highly functional, they may score well on standard rehabilitation outcome measures, but compensation is not the same as restoring the original network architecture. It is a workaround, not a repair. And workarounds, in neurology as in engineering, come with costs. They are less efficient than the original system, more vulnerable to breakdown under load, and can actively prevent the restoration of true recovery by establishing alternative pathways that become dominant before the original ones have the opportunity to reorganize. The standard rehabilitation system, for entirely understandable reasons, is largely optimized for compensation. Its outcome measures, the Barthel Index, the Functional Independence Measure, the Modified Rankin Scale, measure what the person can do, not how they are doing it, and not whether what they are doing reflects genuine neural restoration or an increasingly elaborate compensatory scaffolding. A survivor who can walk 50 meters is scored the same whether they achieve this through restored motor pathway function or through a heavily compensated pattern that loads the intact hemisphere, strains the musculoskeletal system, and will gradually deteriorate as the compensatory demands accumulate. The standard outcome measures tell you what the person can do. They do not tell you whether the brain is genuinely recovering or learning increasingly elaborate ways to pretend that it is. The survivor who asks, "Why does my brain feel like it is working against itself?" deserves an honest answer, because it is. The reorganization that has occurred is real, and it has produced real gains. But it has also created internal conflict between the intact and damaged hemispheres, between compensatory and restorative pathways, between the executive systems being asked to manage too much and the subcortical systems that have not yet been given the conditions they need to rebuild. That conflict has a name, and it has a solution. Question 3. What am I actually rebuilding towards? The third question is perhaps the most fundamental, and the one most likely to be answered, when it is addressed at all, with a response that satisfies neither the clinician nor the survivor. What am I rebuilding towards? Is a question about the destination, and the honest answer in most post-stroke recovery pathways is that no coherent destination has been defined beyond the functional. The goal is to walk, to dress independently, to manage the activities of daily living. These are necessary goals, and achieving them is a genuine and meaningful accomplishment. But for the person who, before their stroke, led organizations, made rapid and complex decisions, navigated multiple time zones, built things, and felt fully and fluently present in the world, they are not enough. The map that standard rehabilitation does not provide. The gap is not a failure of ambition among rehabilitation professionals. It is a structural feature of how post-stroke care was designed and what it was designed to achieve. The rehabilitation system was historically built around the concept of restoring independence, the ability to function without constant assistance from another person. This was, when the framework was developed, a genuinely radical ambition. It moved the goal of stroke care from survival to function, and that shift produced enormous improvements in outcomes for millions of people. But independence and full neurological performance are not the same thing. A person can be fully independent, managing their household, holding a job, appearing to the outside world to have recovered, while living with a profoundly compromised nervous system, one that fatigues in 3 hours, that struggles with divided attention, that has lost the fluid, unconscious quality of movement and thought that they associate with being themselves, and that deteriorates unpredictably under physical or cognitive load. This is the gap that this book addresses. Not the gap between disability and independence, the gap between independence and full neurological performance, the state in which the nervous system is operating as a genuinely integrated, efficient, and adaptive system, not as a collection of compensatory strategies held together by executive willpower and a determination not to give up. Why the sequence matters, an evolutionary logic. Understanding what we are rebuilding toward requires understanding how the nervous system was built in the first place, and that understanding inevitably takes us back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the individual's recovery, but the beginning of movement itself, the evolutionary and developmental sequence through which the human nervous system acquired its architecture. The nervous system was not built from the top down, it was built from the bottom up, through hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history, and then recapitulated in the 9 months of fetal development and the first years of postnatal life. The brainstem came first, the regulator of breathing, heart rate, arousal, and the most basic survival responses. Above it, the cerebellum and basal ganglia, the coordinators of movement timing, balance, and motor automaticity. Above those, the limbic system, the processor of emotion, memory, and social connection. And at the apex, the neocortex, the most recently evolved structure, the one responsible for language, planning, and the complex cognitive functions that define human experience. This hierarchy is not merely anatomical, it is functional. Higher structures depend on lower ones, not metaphorically, but directly, in terms of neural input, metabolic support, and the regulatory signals that allow them to function. A cortex that is not receiving proper input from a well-organized brainstem and subcortical network is like a sophisticated processor running on insufficient power. It may produce output, but not at the level of efficiency or reliability it was designed for. Recovery that begins at the top, at the level of cortical function and conscious effort, is building a skyscraper from the 20th floor up. The foundation is still missing. This is the critical insight on which the 3-layer framework is built. But stating it correctly requires precision, because it is the point at which this approach diverges most sharply from everything the rehabilitation system currently offers, and where the most important misunderstanding tends to arise. The evolutionary and developmental sequence does not mean that recovery proceeds through these layers one at a time, addressing the foundation before touching integration, and integration before the cortex. That would simply replicate the waterfall logic of conventional rehabilitation, directed at different targets. What the developmental hierarchy tells us is not a rigid treatment order. It is a map of interdependencies. Why all 3 layers must be engaged and what each requires of the others to function. In practice, the lower layer, the brainstem and spinal foundation, often receives proportionally greater initial emphasis, simply because it is the substrate on which everything above depends, and the level most often intact, but underactivated after stroke. But this is a matter of clinical weighting, not sequencing. Inputs to all three layers are present from the outset, each reinforcing the others, simultaneously exploiting the neuroplasticity window that the nervous system opens in the aftermath of injury. This is what separates the framework in this book from what preceded it, not a different sequence for the same inputs, but a fundamentally different understanding of what recovery is. A process of directed neuroplasticity in which specific, evidence-based inputs across the full neuromotor hierarchy are delivered in parallel, with the biological precision that neural reorganization actually requires. The question, what am I actually rebuilding towards, has a precise answer. You are rebuilding towards a nervous system in which the brainstem and spinal foundation are organized, the sensory and vestibular integration layer is calibrated, and the cortical and cognitive network is synchronized, not just with itself, but with the body and the environment it inhabits. That is not a vague aspiration. It is a measurable, achievable neurological state. The path to it does not follow a linear staircase, one layer completed before the next. Nor does it treat all three layers identically from day one. It follows the natural neuromotor hierarchy. All three layers engage together, with proportionally greater initial work at the foundational level that the higher layers depend upon. And with the emphasis shifting upward as the system reorganizes, the questions are the beginning. The three questions no one asks are not rhetorical. They are not an indictment of any individual clinician or any individual hospital. They are an honest description of what the current system, for structural and historical reasons, does not deliver, and what every stroke survivor deserves to know before they accept, as good as it gets, as the final word on their recovery. Why am I so exhausted? Because your brain is running an inefficient compensatory program at enormous metabolic cost, in an environment of sustained neuroinflammation, with your highest-order cognitive systems pressed into service as substitutes for subcortical automation they were never designed to replace. Why does my brain feel like it is working against itself? Because it is, in the specific neurologically precise sense that interhemispheric imbalance, compensatory pathway dominance, and the suppression of restorative plasticity are active processes, not passive deficits. What am I actually rebuilding towards? A nervous system that operates as a genuinely integrated hierarchy. Brainstem foundation, sensory integration network, and cortical and cognitive architecture, each receiving what the recovery process requires in proportion to where the work is most needed, in the way that both evolution and development have always required. Not a ladder to be climbed one rung at a time, nor three separate programs running independently. A system engaged together, with initial emphasis naturally weighted toward the foundation that everything else depends upon, and with the precision and intentionality that directed neuroplasticity demands. These are the questions. The following chapters provide the answers, and the framework for acting on them.